My husband had been dead for 11 years when I finally broke the only promise he had ever asked me to keep. The trunk was still exactly where he had left it, pushed against the back wall of our upstairs storage room beneath an old wool blanket that had gathered so much dust I could write my name across it with one finger. For more than 4 decades, I had lived under the same roof as that trunk. I had walked past it thousands of times. I had moved it from one house to another. I had protected it from curious children, repairmen, movers, and eventually grandchildren who thought every locked box in an old woman's house must contain treasure. But I had never opened it. Not once. Because on a cold November evening in 1971, my husband, Thomas, had taken both of my hands in his, looked directly into my eyes, and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "Evelyn, whatever happens to me, promise me you'll keep that trunk locked. Don't throw it away. Don't give it to anyone. Just keep it." I laughed at first. Thomas didn't. When I asked what was inside, he looked toward the staircase as though he were afraid someone might be listening. Then he said, "Something I should have told you about a long time ago." I waited for him to explain. He never did. For years, I convinced myself that a promise was more important than curiosity. Thomas was a good husband. Not perfect but good. We raised 3 children together. We survived lean years, illnesses, arguments, mortgages, weddings, funerals, and all the ordinary storms that slowly turned 2 young strangers into an old married couple. I believed I knew the important parts of the man sleeping beside me. But every few years something would happen that made me wonder. A letter would arrive without a return address, and Thomas would burn it in the fireplace. An unfamiliar man would telephone and hang up when I answered. Once, while looking for Christmas decorations, I found Thomas sitting beside the trunk with a key in his hand and tears running silently down his face. He closed his fist around the key when he saw me. "Not yet," he whispered. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't ask again. When Thomas died, I found the little brass key inside an envelope in the back of his desk drawer. My name was written across the front in his handwriting. Inside there was no letter, no explanation, only the key. Still, I didn't open the trunk. Not that day. Not that year. Not for 11 years. Then, one rainy Sunday afternoon, my granddaughter Lily came upstairs carrying a photograph she had found behind a loose drawer in Thomas's old desk. She placed it on the kitchen table and asked me a question that made the room seem suddenly smaller. "Grandma, who is this little girl standing beside Grandpa?" I looked at the photograph. Thomas couldn't have been more than 25. And beside him stood a little girl I had never seen before. On the back, written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words. "Tell Evelyn the truth." That evening, after Lily went home, I climbed the stairs alone. I removed the dusty blanket. I sat on the wooden floor in front of the trunk my husband had forbidden me to open more than 50 years earlier. And for the first time I put the brass key into the lock. For the first several years of our marriage, the trunk became part of the furniture of our lives. It sat upstairs behind boxes of winter clothes and Christmas decorations, rarely mentioned and almost forgotten. I respected Thomas's privacy because in those days I believed marriage did not require knowing every thought another person had ever possessed. Everyone carried pieces of themselves from before they met you. Old disappointments, embarrassments, grief. Thomas had lost his mother when he was young and rarely spoke about his father, so I assumed the trunk contained reminders of a childhood he preferred not to revisit. Then, in the spring of 1966, the first letter arrived. I remember the envelope because there was something unusual about it. There was no return address, and Thomas's name had been written by hand in blue ink. I placed it beside his dinner plate without thinking anything of it. When Thomas came home and saw it, he stopped walking. Where did this come from? The mailbox. Did anyone bring it? Not that I saw. He picked up the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, he slipped it into his jacket pocket. That night, sometime after midnight, I woke and discovered his side of the bed empty. I went downstairs expecting to find him drinking water. Instead, I saw him standing in front of the fireplace. The letter was open in his hand. He read it once, then again, And then he dropped it into the flames. I watched from the hallway as the paper curled black at the edges. Thomas! He spun around. For a second, the expression on his face frightened me. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was fear. What was that? Nothing. People don't burn nothing at midnight. He stared into the fireplace. Someone from a long time ago. Who? It doesn't matter anymore. I wanted to push him. I wanted to demand an answer. But then Daniel, still a baby, began crying upstairs, and the moment disappeared into the thousand small emergencies that make up family life. More letters came. Not frequently. Sometimes 2 years passed between them. Sometimes only a few months. Thomas always destroyed them. Then the telephone calls began. The caller never asked for me. If I answered, there would be silence followed by a click. If Thomas answered, he would take the telephone into another room and speak quietly. Once I heard him say, "I told you I can't do that." Another time, "She doesn't know. She doesn't know." Those 3 words stayed with me. One evening I finally confronted him. "Is there another woman?" Thomas looked genuinely stunned. "No." "Then tell me what's happening." He sat at our kitchen table for a very long time. Finally he reached across and covered my hand with his. "There was something before you, Evelyn." My stomach tightened. "What?" "A mistake." "What kind of mistake?" He looked toward the ceiling, toward the room where the trunk sat above us. Then he shook his head. "One day I'll explain everything." I pulled my hand away. "When?" "When I know telling you won't hurt someone who doesn't deserve to be hurt." At the time I thought he meant me. Many years later, I would discover he had been talking about someone else entirely. The years after that conversation were strange because nothing changed and yet everything had changed. Thomas still woke before sunrise, still kissed me before leaving for work, still came home smelling of machine oil and cold air, still helped the children with their homework at the kitchen table. To anyone looking through our windows, we were an ordinary family living an ordinary life. But I had begun noticing things I would once have ignored. Every unexpected telephone call made me listen. Every unfamiliar envelope made my stomach tighten. And whenever Thomas disappeared upstairs for more than a few minutes, I wondered whether he was sitting beside the trunk. I hated myself for becoming suspicious. More than that, I hated the trunk for giving my suspicion somewhere to live. In October of 1968, Thomas told me he needed to travel for work. That wasn't unusual. The company occasionally sent him to repair equipment in neighboring towns, and he was normally gone for 1 or 2 nights. This time, however, he packed on a Sunday evening and said he would be away until Thursday. "Where are they sending you?" I asked while folding one of his shirts. He paused before answering. "Westfield." I knew the name only vaguely. It was a small town several hours away. I kissed him goodbye the following morning and thought nothing more about it until Wednesday afternoon, when the telephone rang. A man from Thomas's company asked whether Thomas could cover a job the following week. "You'll have to ask him when he gets back from Westfield," I said. There was a silence. "Westfield," the man repeated. "We haven't sent anyone to Westfield in months." I felt as if the floor had shifted beneath me. I made some excuse, ended the call, and spent the rest of that day moving through the house mechanically. I fed the children. I washed dishes. Folded laundry. All the while, one thought repeated itself. Thomas had lied to me. Not avoided a question. Not hidden a letter. Lied. When he returned Thursday evening, I waited until the children were asleep. Then I placed his suitcase on the kitchen table and asked him where he had really been. Thomas didn't attempt to invent another story. He sat down slowly and rubbed both hands across his face. "Westfield," he said. "That part was true. Your company didn't send you." "No." "Then why were you there?" He looked at me with an exhaustion I had never seen before. "Someone needed me." "Who?" He didn't answer. "A woman." "No." "Then who, Thomas?" He stared down at the table. "A child." I remember the ticking of the kitchen clock after he said those words. Nothing else. Just that clock and my own heartbeat. Whose child? Yes. Thomas stood and walked toward the window. It's complicated. I nearly laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. You disappeared for 4 days to see a child you've never mentioned. And your explanation is that it's complicated? He turned toward me. I have never been unfaithful to you, Evelyn. Not once. You need to believe that. Then tell me who the child is. He opened his mouth, but no words came. That was the closest our marriage ever came to breaking. I told Thomas the first would take the children to my sister's house if he refused to explain. He begged me not to. For nearly an hour we argued in whispers because our 3 children were sleeping upstairs. Finally Thomas said something I didn't understand until decades later. She was part of my responsibility before I ever knew you. I asked whether he had a daughter. He immediately said no. The speed of his answer convinced me he was telling the truth, or at least part of it. Then why are you responsible for her? He lowered his eyes. Because someone else can't be. That was all he would tell me. The next morning, I found Thomas asleep on the living room sofa. On the floor beside his jacket was a small piece of paper that must have fallen from his pocket. I should have left it there. Instead, I picked it up. It was a receipt from a drugstore in Westfield. Children's cough medicine, aspirin, and a small stuffed rabbit. I stood there holding that receipt and felt something unexpected. Until then, I had imagined Thomas traveling secretly to meet someone from a hidden romantic past. But those purchases told a different story. Whoever the child was, she had been sick. Thomas had gone because she needed him. I put the receipt back inside his jacket and never told him I had seen it. 3 months passed before anything else happened. Then, one January morning, an envelope arrived. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Thomas. It was addressed to me. I remember staring at my own name for several seconds. The handwriting was unfamiliar. There was no return address. I carried it into the kitchen and began opening it when Thomas walked through the back door unexpectedly. He had forgotten his work gloves. The moment he saw the envelope, all the color disappeared from his face. Where did you get that? The mailbox. He crossed the kitchen faster than I had ever seen him move and took it from my hands. Thomas, I'm sorry. Give it back. I can't. It's addressed to me. I know. That answer frightened me more than anything else. Thomas slipped the envelope into his coat. Who sent it? He didn't answer. Is it about the child? His eyes met mine. And that was answer enough. Thomas, someone is trying to tell me something. I know. Then why won't you let them? His voice became very quiet. Because they're not trying to help you. They're trying to punish me. He left for work carrying the letter. That evening I checked his coat. It was gone. I never found out what had been written inside. For years, I resented him for taking that letter. After opening the trunk, however, I discovered a copy of it. The original had not been destroyed. Thomas had kept it. And the first sentence was enough to make my hands tremble. Evelyn, your husband has been protecting a lie since before the day you met him. But in 1969 I knew none of that. All I knew was that somewhere in Westfield there was a little girl my husband secretly visited. Someone was trying desperately to tell me why. And Thomas believed the truth was dangerous enough to protect even at the cost of my trust. Then, several months later, I saw the girl myself. It happened completely by accident. And she was holding Thomas's hand. It was a Saturday in May of 1969. The kind of spring morning when the whole town seemed determined to be outdoors. Sarah needed new shoes. Michael had somehow torn the knees out of another pair of trousers. And Daniel had been promised ice cream if he behaved while I ran errands. Thomas had left early that morning, telling me he was helping a coworker repair an old tractor outside town. By noon, I had finished most of my shopping and was walking toward the department store with the children when Daniel began complaining that he was hungry. There was a small diner across the street, and as I turned toward it, I saw Thomas. First, I smiled automatically. I nearly called his name. Then I noticed the little girl beside him. She looked about 7 or 8 years old. She had dark hair tied back with a pale ribbon and wore a blue coat that seemed slightly too large for her. Thomas was carrying a paper bag in one hand. The girl held his other hand. There was nothing unusual about the gesture itself. What stopped me was the way Thomas looked at her. I knew that expression. I had seen it when he watched our own children sleeping. It was tenderness mixed with worry, the expression of a man who felt responsible for keeping a small person safe. The girl said something I couldn't hear. Thomas bent down to listen and smiled. Then he reached into the paper bag and handed her something wrapped in tissue. She opened it and pulled out a red scarf. Her entire face brightened. "Mom!" Sarah tugged my sleeve. "Isn't that Daddy?" Thomas heard her. His head snapped toward us. The smile disappeared from his face. For several seconds nobody moved. Then the little girl looked from Thomas to me. I will never forget the confusion in her eyes. Thomas released her hand and walked quickly across the sidewalk toward us. "Evelyn." I looked past him at the child. "You said you were fixing a tractor." Thomas lowered his voice. "Not here." "Why not here?" "Because the children are with you." "Your children are with me, Thomas." "Who is she?" Michael and Sarah were watching us now. Even little Daniel seemed to understand something was wrong. Thomas glanced back. The girl hadn't moved. She stood beside the storefront, clutching the red scarf against her chest. "Please," he whispered. "Take the kids to the diner. I'll explain later." I had heard those words too many times. Later. One day. When the time was right. Our marriage had become filled with promises of explanations that never arrived. "No," I said. "You explain now." Before Thomas could answer, an older woman emerged from the store. She was perhaps in her late 50s, thin and severe-looking, wearing a gray coat despite the warmth. The moment she saw me, she stopped. Her expression changed from surprise to something much closer to anger. She walked directly toward the little girl and placed both hands on her shoulders. "We should go." Thomas stepped toward her. "Margaret, wait." The woman stared at him. "You've done enough." "Margaret." I had never heard the name before. Then she looked directly at me. "So you're Evelyn." The way she said my name made my skin prickle. "Do I know you?" "Yes." "No," she replied. "But I know quite a lot about you." Thomas moved between us. "Margaret." She ignored him. "Has he told you?" My heart began pounding. "Told me what?" Thomas's voice hardened. "Stop." Margaret gave a bitter little laugh. "Of course he hasn't." The girl suddenly looked frightened. "Aunt Margaret, can we go home?" "Aunt Margaret." I looked at Thomas. His face had become almost gray. Margaret took the girl's hand and began walking away. Thomas followed them several steps. I couldn't hear what he said, but Margaret turned and answered loudly enough for me to catch every word. "You made your choice years ago." Then she led the child around the corner and disappeared. Thomas stood motionless on the sidewalk. I told Michael to take Sarah and Daniel into the diner and order lunch. Michael was only 8, but he understood from my expression that he shouldn't argue. Once they were inside, I faced my husband. "Who is Margaret?" Thomas rubbed his forehead. "Someone I knew before you." "And the girl?" He looked toward the corner where they had disappeared. "Her name is Anna." It was the first time I heard that name. "Who is Anna?" Thomas didn't answer. "Is she related to you?" A long silence followed. "Yes." One word. That one word changed everything. "How?" Thomas closed his eyes. "Please, Evelyn." "No. You don't get to say please anymore. You lied about Westfield. You take telephone calls in secret. You burn letters. Someone sent a letter addressed to me and you took it. Now I find you holding hands with a little girl you've never mentioned. And you're telling me she's family. Who is she?" Thomas looked at me. Then he said, "She's my niece." I remember feeling almost relieved. Niece. It was strange, certainly, but not the terrible possibility my imagination had created. "Your niece. You told me you didn't have any brothers or sisters." "I don't." The relief vanished immediately. Then how can she be your niece? Thomas looked toward the diner window. Our children were sitting inside a booth watching us. Not here. This time I agreed. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and I sat at the kitchen table. He told me a story I would believe for nearly 40 years. He said that before we met, he had been close friends with a man named Robert Hale. Robert had married young and had a daughter, Anna. According to Thomas, Robert died unexpectedly when Anna was still a baby. Margaret was Robert's older sister and had taken responsibility for raising the child. Thomas explained that Robert had once been like a brother to him, which was why he sometimes referred to Anna as his niece. Before Robert died, Thomas had promised to help make sure Anna was cared for. It explained almost everything. Almost. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas stared down at his hands. Margaret doesn't want my involvement. Why? Because she blames me for what happened to Robert. My anger softened slightly. What happened? An accident. What kind of accident? Thomas shook his head. I can't talk about that. There it was again. Another locked door. Still, I wanted to believe him. More than anything, I wanted my husband back. So I accepted the explanation because it was easier than continuing to question the man I loved. But before we went upstairs, I asked one final question. Does Anna know who you are? Thomas hesitated. She knows I'm Uncle Thomas. He nodded. Then he added something quietly. That's all she can ever know. I should have asked what he meant. Instead, I went to bed. 3 years later, in 1972, I was cleaning the upstairs storage room when I accidentally knocked a cardboard box against the old trunk. Something slipped from beneath its lid and fluttered onto the floor. It was a photograph. Thomas was standing beside a young man I didn't recognize. Between them stood a woman holding a newborn baby. On the back, someone had written 3 names. Thomas, Robert, Anna. But the woman's face was the part that made my blood run cold. Because I had seen her before. She was in our wedding album. I carried the photograph downstairs as carefully as if it were made of glass. Thomas was at work, the children were at school, and for once the house was completely silent. I placed the picture on the kitchen table, made myself a cup of coffee I never drank, and stared at the woman's face until I was certain my memory wasn't deceiving me. She was younger in the photograph with the baby, her hair longer and her expression softer, but there was no question. I had seen that woman standing at the back of the church on the day Thomas and I were married. She wasn't part of our wedding party. She wasn't in any of the formal photographs. In fact, I had forgotten about her almost completely until that moment. But one photograph in our album had captured her accidentally. She stood near the church doors while Thomas and I greeted guests. Everyone else was looking toward us. She was looking only at Thomas. I retrieved the wedding album from the cabinet and turned through the pages until I found the photograph. There she was. Same eyes. Same narrow face. Same small mark near her left eyebrow. I placed the 2 pictures side by side. The photograph from the trunk had 3 names written on the back. Thomas, Robert, Anna. Nothing identified the woman. That omission felt deliberate. Someone had carefully written the names of both men and the baby, yet left the baby's mother unnamed. I began searching the wedding photographs for another image of her. I found 2. In one, she stood partly hidden behind an older couple. In another, she was outside near a car, speaking with a woman I recognized immediately. Margaret. My hands began trembling. Margaret had been at my wedding. The woman who claimed Thomas had made his choice years ago had watched me marry him, and Thomas had never told me she was there. When he returned from work that evening, I waited until after dinner. The children went upstairs, and I placed both photographs on the table. Thomas stopped halfway into the kitchen. Where did you get that? I didn't answer immediately. Who is she? Thomas put down his lunchbox. Evelyn. No, not this time. No promises about later. No telling me you're protecting somebody. I want her name. He looked at the photograph for so long that I thought he might refuse again. Finally he whispered, "Claire." "Claire what?" "Claire Hale. Hale. Robert's wife." Thomas nodded. "Anna's mother." Another nod. "Then why was she at our wedding?" His eyes lifted toward mine. "Because I invited Robert. Robert isn't in these pictures. He didn't come. But Claire did." Thomas sat down. I remained standing. "Why?" "I didn't know she would." "And Margaret?" "She came with Claire." "You recognized them?" "Yes." "And you never thought your wife deserved to know that two people connected to this enormous secret were standing at the back of our church?" Thomas rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit he had whenever he was struggling to say something. "Claire wanted to speak to me." "About Anna?" "Yes." "What did she want?" He didn't answer. I slapped my palm against the table hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. "Thomas." His voice rose for perhaps the first time in our marriage. "She wanted me to leave with them." The kitchen went silent. I stared at him. "Leave where?" "Westfield." "Why?" Thomas pushed his chair away and stood. "Because Claire was frightened." "Of Robert?" "No." "Then of what?" Thomas walked toward the sink and looked through the window into the darkness. "Of what was going to happen." I could feel myself becoming angry again. "You told me Robert died in an accident." "He did." "When?" Thomas didn't move. "When, Thomas?" 3 weeks after our wedding. I felt the air leave my lungs. 3 weeks. The photograph from the trunk showed Robert alive, standing beside Thomas and Claire with baby Anna. Claire appeared at our wedding. 3 weeks later Robert was dead. 4 years afterward, Thomas secretly visited Robert's daughter and received letters he refused to let me read. "What happened to him?" Thomas turned. "There was a fire." "Where?" "At a house outside Westfield." "Was Claire there?" "No." "Anna?" "No." "Then why does Margaret blame you?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Because I was there." That answer changed the room. "You were there when Robert died?" "Yes." "You never told me." "I came home the following morning." I remembered that morning. We had been married less than a month. Thomas arrived shortly before sunrise after telling me he had been called to an emergency repair job. His shirt smelled like smoke. There was a cut across his left hand. I remembered washing the wound at our kitchen sink while he told me a piece of machinery had overheated. Another lie. What really happened that night? Thomas looked toward the ceiling, toward the trunk. Then he said, "Everything you want to know is upstairs." My heart began pounding. For one extraordinary second, I thought he was finally going to open it. Thomas climbed the stairs. Followed. He entered the storage room and moved the boxes away from the trunk. Then he knelt beside it. From beneath his shirt, he pulled a small brass key attached to a thin cord around his neck. I had never noticed it before. He inserted the key into the lock. But he didn't turn it. His hand simply rested there. "Open it," I whispered. Thomas closed his eyes. "I can't." "Why did you bring me up here?" "Because I need you to understand something." He removed the key and stood. "This trunk contains everything I kept from you." I stared at him. "Then open it." "If I do, I can't protect Anna anymore." "Protect her from what?" "From knowing why her father died." For the first time, I understood that the secret wasn't simply about Thomas. It was about Robert, about Claire, about Margaret, about the fire, and most of all about Anna. Thomas took my hands. "Promise me something." I almost laughed from disbelief. "You want another promise?" "If anything ever happens to me, keep this trunk. Don't destroy it. Don't give it to Margaret. Don't give it to Anna. Keep it locked until..." He stopped. "Until what?" Thomas looked at me with tears gathering in his eyes. "Until keeping the secret becomes crueler than telling the truth." Those words stayed with me for decades. But that evening I was too angry to understand them. I pulled my hands away and walked downstairs. The photograph remained on the kitchen table until morning. When I woke, it was gone. Thomas had returned it to the trunk. And sometime during the night he added something else. A letter addressed to me. I wouldn't read it until more than 40 years later. After that night I stopped asking Thomas about the trunk. Not because I no longer wanted answers, but because I had begun to understand that every answer created another question. Robert was dead. Claire had appeared at our wedding. Margaret blamed Thomas for something connected to Robert's death. Anna was being protected from the truth. And somewhere inside that old wooden trunk sat an explanation my husband believed could damage several lives. I could have demanded that he open it. I could have taken the key while he slept. There were nights when I considered doing exactly that. But then morning would come. One of the children would spill milk across the table. Thomas would rush downstairs looking for his work gloves, and ordinary life would return. It is remarkable how long a family can live beside a secret when there are lunches to pack, bills to pay, birthdays to celebrate, and children growing faster than anyone expects. Then, in the summer of 1974, something changed. The letters stopped. For years, those envelopes without return addresses had appeared unpredictably. Sometimes Thomas received several within a few months. Sometimes an entire year passed without one. But after July of 1974, there were none. Telephone calls stopped too. Thomas no longer disappeared into another room when the phone rang. He stopped making unexplained trips to Westfield. First I felt relieved. Whatever had haunted him seemed finally to have loosened its grip. Thomas became lighter. He laughed more. He spent weekends fixing things around the house. He built Sarah a desk for her bedroom and helped Michael restore an old bicycle. For the first time in years, I began believing the past had finally decided to leave us alone. Then one evening Thomas came home carrying a newspaper. He didn't eat dinner. He simply sat at the table reading the same small article over and over. When he went upstairs, I picked up the newspaper. A woman named Claire Hale had died. The article was brief. She had been 41. There was no photograph, no mention of Robert, and only one surviving relative was listed. Her daughter, Anna Hale. I found Thomas sitting on the edge of our bed. Claire died. He nodded. Did you know she was sick? Another nod. Is that why you went to Westfield? Sometimes. I sat beside him. For once, I didn't ask anything else. Thomas cried quietly. I had seen my husband cry only a handful of times. When his mother died. When Daniel was hospitalized with pneumonia. When Michael left home for college. But this grief was different. It carried something heavier than sadness. Carried guilt. 3 days later, Thomas attended Claire's funeral alone. He asked me not to come. I agreed. When he returned that evening, he went directly upstairs. I heard the storage room door open. Then the unmistakable sound of the trunk being moved. For nearly an hour, Thomas remained there. When he finally came downstairs, his eyes were red. Is Anna all right? He asked. She's 17 now. That surprised me. In my mind she remained the little girl in the blue coat holding the red scarf. What happens to her? Margaret will stay with her until she finishes school. And after that? Thomas looked toward the window. Hopefully she gets far away from all of this. I didn't understand what all of this meant. 2 weeks later, a car pulled into our driveway. Margaret stepped out. I recognized her immediately despite the years that had passed. Thomas was at work. The children were gone. I stood behind the screen door watching her approach. She didn't smile. Mrs. Carter. Yes. I'm Margaret Hale. I remember. She glanced toward the upstairs windows. Is Thomas here? No. Good. That single word made me uneasy. I invited her inside anyway. Margaret refused coffee. She refused to sit down. She stood in the middle of my living room clutching her purse with both hands. I came because Claire is dead. I know. And because Thomas still has something that belongs to Anna. My heart began beating faster. What? Margaret looked toward the ceiling again. The trunk. Felt cold. You know about it. I know exactly what's inside it. Those words were almost enough to make me run upstairs. Instead, I asked, "Then tell me." Margaret studied my face. "Thomas hasn't." "No." A bitter expression crossed hers. "Of course he hasn't. What is inside?" "Proof." "Proof of what?" She stepped closer. "That the story Thomas told everyone about Robert's death isn't true." I stared at her. "What story?" "That the fire was an accident." My mouth went dry. "Are you saying it wasn't?" Margaret didn't answer directly. Instead, she opened her purse and removed a small photograph. She handed it to me. The picture showed the burned remains of a house. 3 men stood near what was left of the front porch. One was a police officer. Another I didn't recognize. The third was Thomas. On the back someone had written a date. 3 weeks after our wedding. What does this prove? Nothing by itself. Then why show me? Because your husband wasn't simply there after the fire. Margaret's eyes hardened. He was inside that house before it started. I felt my fingers tighten around the photograph. How do you know? Claire told me. What was Thomas doing there? Margaret looked toward the front door, almost as if she regretted coming. Then she said, "Trying to convince Robert to disappear." I couldn't speak. Disappear. Leave Westfield. Leave Claire. Leave Anna. Never come back. Why would Thomas do that? Margaret stared at me for several seconds. Because Robert had discovered something. What? Ask your husband. No. You came into my house. You tell me. Margaret's expression softened for the first time. I thought you knew more than you do. Then help me understand. She shook her head. I promised Claire I wouldn't. I almost laughed. Everyone in my husband's past seemed bound by promises except me. Then why are you here? Because the trunk belongs to Anna. Thomas says it doesn't. Thomas has spent years deciding what everyone else is allowed to know. Margaret walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned. If he dies before you, don't let him take that secret with him. Then she said something I would remember 11 years after Thomas's death, when I finally placed the key into that brass lock. Whatever he tells you, Evelyn, don't burn what's inside. Left. Thomas came home 2 hours later. I placed the photograph of the burned house on the kitchen table. He stared at it. Then he looked at me. Margaret was here. Thomas didn't ask why. He already knew. She says the fire wasn't an accident. He pulled out a chair but didn't sit. She's wrong. She says you were inside before it started. I was. She says you wanted Robert to disappear. Thomas looked directly at me. That part is true. Why? His answer came slowly. Because Robert was going to tell Anna something that would destroy Claire's life. Anna was a baby. Not then. Later. I shook my head. You're not making sense. I know. Then make sense. Thomas walked toward the staircase. For a moment I thought we were going back to the trunk. Instead he stopped at the first step. Robert wasn't the man everyone thought he was. What did he do? Thomas looked at me. That's the wrong question. Then what's the right one? His eyes filled with the same sadness I had seen after Claire's funeral. The question is what Claire did because of him. He went upstairs. I remained in the kitchen holding the photograph of the burned house. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the trunk contained evidence of something far worse than a family secret. 3 nights later, someone broke into our house. Nothing valuable was taken. The television remained. My jewelry remained. Thomas's wallet was untouched. Only one room had been disturbed. The upstairs storage room. And whoever had entered our house had tried to open the trunk. The police officer who came to our house the next morning kept asking the same question. Are you sure nothing was stolen? Thomas stood in the upstairs storage room with his arms folded while I tried to make sense of the mess around us. Boxes had been opened. Old clothes were scattered across the floor. Christmas decorations had been crushed beneath someone's shoes. A drawer from an old dresser had been pulled completely out and left upside down. Yet the only object that showed signs of deliberate damage was the trunk. Fresh scratches surrounded the brass lock. Someone had tried to force a narrow metal object between the lid and the frame, but the old iron fittings had held. "Nothing that we can see," I told the officer. He looked at the trunk. "What's in there?" Before I could answer, Thomas said, "Family papers." The officer crouched beside the lock. "Valuable." "Not financially." "Then somebody apparently thinks they're valuable for another reason." I watched Thomas carefully. He seemed less surprised than frightened, and that distinction mattered. After the officer left, Thomas immediately dragged the trunk away from the wall. He examined the back, the hinges, and finally the lock. "You know who did this?" I said. "No. But you know why they came." He remained silent. "Was it Margaret?" Thomas shook his head. "Margaret wouldn't break into our house." "Then who?" He stood and looked around the room. "I don't know." "You're lying." He looked at me sharply. "I'm not lying. There are several people who might want what's inside." Several people. Until that moment, I had believed the secret involved only Thomas, Claire, Robert, Margaret, and Anna. Suddenly the circle became larger. Thomas removed the brass key from beneath his shirt. For one hopeful second, I thought he had finally decided to open the trunk. Instead, he checked the lock, put the key back around his neck, and said, "We're moving it." "Where?" "Somewhere safer." I stepped between him and the trunk. "No." He stared at me. "Evelyn, this thing has been sitting inside my house for years. Someone has now broken into my home because of it. Our children sleep down the hallway. You don't get to tell me nothing anymore." Thomas looked toward the doorway. "Keep your voice down." "Why? Are you afraid the children might discover their father has another life?" His face tightened. "This isn't another life." "Then what is it?" "A debt." That word stopped me. "To whom?" He looked at the trunk. "To Robert." I couldn't understand. Margaret had spent years blaming Thomas for Robert's death, yet Thomas spoke as though he owed Robert something. "You said Robert wasn't a good man." "He wasn't." "Then why do you owe him?" Thomas sat on one of the boxes. For the first time he seemed old to me. He was only in his 40s, but suddenly I could see how much the secret had worn him down. "Because people aren't only one thing, Evelyn. Robert did terrible things. He also did one good thing when it mattered most." "What?" Thomas looked at me. "He kept Anna alive." The words made no sense. "His own daughter." Thomas's expression changed. He realized immediately that he had said too much. "Thomas, what does that mean?" He stood. "Forget I said it." "Absolutely not." "Evelyn, was someone trying to hurt Anna?" He walked toward the door, caught his arm. "Was that what the fire was about?" He stopped. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he said something so quietly I almost missed it. "The fire wasn't supposed to happen." I felt cold from my shoulders down. "You told me Margaret was wrong." "Margaret believes someone deliberately started it." "Did they?" Thomas stared at the floor. "I don't know." "Then what do you know?" "I know Robert called me that night. He was terrified. He wanted money, a car, and enough time to get out of Westfield. With Claire and Anna." "No." That answer disturbed me. "Without them." Thomas nodded. "Why?" "Because he believed leaving them behind was the only way to protect them." "From whom?" Thomas rubbed his forehead. "A man Robert had been working for." This was the first time Thomas had ever mentioned another man. "Who?" "I never met him." "Name?" "Victor." "Victor what?" "I don't know if the name he gave Robert was real." "What kind of work?" Thomas looked toward the trunk again. "Things Robert should never have become involved in." I waited for more, but he stopped. "Illegal things." Thomas nodded once. I sat down. Everything I had imagined about the trunk had been personal. Another woman, a hidden child, an old betrayal. Now the secret seemed to stretch into something darker from Thomas's youth. Something he had spent years trying to bury. Did Robert die because of this Victor? I don't know. Is Victor the person who broke into our house? I don't know that either. Is he still alive? Thomas hesitated. I thought he was dead. That word frightened me more than a definite answer would have. That afternoon, Thomas bought a new lock for the storage room door. He also moved the trunk into our bedroom temporarily. For 3 nights, it sat less than 10 feet from where I slept. On the 4th night, I woke around 2 in the morning and found Thomas sitting on the floor beside it. The trunk was open. Only slightly. Perhaps 3 inches. Thomas had one hand beneath the lid. I could see papers inside. Dozens of them. Envelopes tied together with string. Photographs. A small cloth bundle. Something that looked like a notebook. And on top of everything was a child's red scarf. The same red scarf I had watched Thomas give Anna years earlier. Thomas! He slammed the lid shut. The sound woke me completely. What are you doing? He locked it. Checking something. What? He didn't answer. Got out of bed. Was that Anna's scarf? Thomas looked surprised. You remember it? Of course I remember it. He sat back against the bed. Claire returned it. Why? Because Anna wasn't supposed to keep anything from me. I sat beside him on the floor. Margaret. He nodded. She didn't want you around Anna. No. Because she blamed you for Robert. Partly. What was the other reason? Thomas looked exhausted. Margaret was afraid Anna would become attached to me. Why would that frighten her? Thomas stared at the locked trunk. Then came the answer. Because eventually Anna would start asking why. Why what? Why I cared about her so much. My heartbeat quickened. I thought again about that afternoon years earlier. Thomas holding Anna's hand, bending down to listen to her, buying her the red scarf, looking at her with the same tenderness he showed our children. You told me she wasn't your daughter. She isn't. Then why? Thomas leaned his head against the side of the bed. Because I was there the night she was born. That was new. You were. He nodded. So was Robert. No. I stared at him. Robert wasn't there when his own daughter was born. Thomas closed his eyes. No. Where was he? Gone. Where? I don't know. He disappeared for almost 4 months. And Claire? She was alone. Except for you. Thomas opened his eyes. Except for me. There was something in the way he said it that made an old fear return. Did you love Claire? He didn't answer immediately. And sometimes a pause tells you more than a sentence. Thomas. Before I met you, he said slowly. I thought I did. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Did she love you? I don't know. Was Anna? No. He interrupted before I could finish. Anna is not my daughter. I swear to you. I believed him. But I also understood something for the first time. Claire had not simply been Robert's wife. She had once been someone Thomas loved. And whatever happened between the 3 of them had begun before Anna was born. Thomas stood and pushed the trunk against the wall. We'll take it somewhere safe tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. At 7:30 the next morning our telephone rang. Thomas answered. He didn't say hello. He simply listened. Then his face changed. Who is this? Silence. How did you get this number? More silence. Then Thomas looked directly at the trunk. What do you want? I couldn't hear the voice on the other end. But I heard Thomas's answer. No. Robert gave those papers to me, and I'm keeping them. My stomach tightened. Thomas listened again. Then he said, Anna doesn't know anything. Another pause. Leave her out of this. The caller hung up. Thomas remained with the receiver pressed against his ear. Was it Victor? Yes. He slowly replaced the telephone. No. Then who? Thomas looked at me. I don't know. But this time I believed him. Because whoever had called knew something Thomas hadn't expected anyone else to know. Robert had given him the contents of the trunk, which meant the trunk had never really belonged to Thomas. And Robert had given it to him before the night he died. After that telephone call, Thomas changed. It wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but I noticed because I had spent years learning the rhythm of that man. He began checking the rearview mirror whenever we drove. He locked doors he had once left open. If a car remained parked across the street too long, Thomas would stand behind the curtains and watch until it left. Most unsettling of all, he stopped wearing the brass key around his neck. I asked where he had put it. Somewhere safe, he said. I didn't know then that he had already begun preparing for the possibility that one day I would need to find it without him. For nearly a week, Thomas refused to discuss the telephone call. Then, on Sunday evening after the children were asleep, he came into the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me and sat across the table. "You deserve something," he said. I almost laughed. "Something?" He nodded. "Not everything, but enough to understand why I've kept the trunk." I wanted to tell him that after all those years I deserved everything, not whatever portion of the truth he had decided I could safely handle. But I could see something different in his expression. Thomas wasn't trying to avoid the conversation. He was finally trying to begin it. He told me he had met Robert Hale when they were 17. They worked together at a repair shop outside Westfield. Robert was everything Thomas wasn't. Impulsive, charming, reckless, the sort of young man who could enter a room full of strangers and leave knowing everyone's name. They became close almost immediately. Robert's family had little money, and his father had disappeared when he was young. Thomas's home wasn't much happier. For several years, the 2 boys were practically brothers. Then Claire entered their lives. She worked at a lunch counter near the garage, Thomas told me. We both noticed her. I looked down at my coffee. Even decades later, hearing my husband describe another woman that way wasn't pleasant. "You loved her." Thomas thought for a moment. "I was 19. At 19 you call many things love." Claire initially spent more time with Thomas. They went to movies, county fairs, and long drives through the countryside. Nothing formal according to him, but enough that Thomas believed something might eventually develop. Then his mother became seriously ill. He left Westfield for several months to care for her. When he returned, Claire and Robert were together. "Were you angry?" "Yes. At first. At Robert. Mostly at myself. I had never told Claire what I wanted. Robert did. Within a year, Claire became pregnant. Robert married her. Anna was born several months later. But you said Robert wasn't there when Anna was born." "He wasn't." "Why?" Thomas stared into his coffee. "Because by then Robert had started working for Victor." The name returned. Thomas explained that Robert had become involved with a group of men who used legitimate businesses to hide stolen equipment and fraudulent transactions. Thomas didn't give me every detail, perhaps because he didn't know every detail himself. Robert's job began simply. Repair machines, change identifying marks, deliver equipment to buyers who asked no questions. The money was better than anything he had ever earned honestly. Then the jobs became larger and the people around him more dangerous. Why didn't he stop? He tried. When? When Claire became pregnant. According to Thomas, Robert told Victor he wanted out. Victor responded by reminding him how much he knew. Robert disappeared soon afterward, supposedly to avoid both the authorities and the people he had worked for. Claire was left alone, pregnant and terrified. Thomas helped her because there was nobody else. "And that's when you thought you loved her?" Thomas nodded. "Did anything happen between you?" "No." I watched his face carefully. He didn't look away. "No, Evelyn. Claire was carrying Robert's child. She was frightened and alone. Helped her. That's all. Then Robert returned. 4 months later. And Claire took him back. For Anna." Thomas said Robert promised he was finished with Victor. For a while perhaps he was. He found legitimate work, moved Claire and baby Anna into a small rented house, and tried to become the husband and father he should have been from the beginning. Thomas stepped away from their lives. Soon afterward, he moved to another town. That was where he met me. I understood the timeline now. But not the trunk. When did Robert give it to you? Thomas leaned back in his chair. 3 days before our wedding. My hands tightened around my cup. 3 days. He came to see me. Why? He was scared. Robert had arrived unexpectedly late at night. He drove an unfamiliar car and refused to come inside. The trunk was in the back seat. He told Thomas that Victor's old operation had never truly disappeared. Someone had contacted him and wanted him involved again. Robert refused. Then threats began. According to Thomas, Robert had spent years secretly collecting documents connected to the operation. Names, transactions, letters, photographs, receipts, and records that could prove what several people had done. The papers in the trunk, I said. Thomas nodded. Why give them to you? Insurance. Against Victor. Against everyone. That word made me uneasy. Robert believed that as long as people thought those records existed somewhere, they would hesitate to harm him or his family. But keeping the papers in his own house had become too dangerous. So he gave them to the one person he still trusted. Thomas. Why didn't he go to the police? He didn't trust them. Why? Because one of the names in those papers belonged to someone who wore a badge. I stared at him. Suddenly the secrecy made more sense. What did Robert ask you to do? Keep the trunk hidden. If anything happened to him, make sure Claire and Anna were safe. If they were ever threatened, use the papers. Did you know what was inside? Not then. When did you open it? Thomas looked toward the ceiling. The night Robert died. The fire. You opened it after the fire. Yes. What did you find? He rubbed his forehead. Enough to understand why Robert was afraid. Names. Yes. Victor. Yes. Who else? Thomas hesitated. Claire. Froze. Claire's name was in the papers. Yes. Why? That's the part one can't tell you. Anger returned immediately. You've just told me about stolen equipment, criminals, corrupt officials, Robert giving you evidence 3 days before our wedding, and you're still stopping? Because everything changes when you understand why Claire's name is there. For whom? For Anna. Again Anna. Always Anna. I stood and walked toward the sink. Was Claire involved in Robert's crimes? Thomas didn't answer. Did she know what he was doing? Eventually. Did she help him? Silence. Turn. Thomas. His expression told me the answer wasn't simple. Claire did something, he said, but not for the reason those papers make it look like. What did she do? She saved her daughter. I thought of what Thomas had said earlier. Robert kept Anna alive. Now he was saying Claire had saved her too. Saved Anna from whom? Thomas looked directly at me. Robert. For several seconds I couldn't understand the words. You said Robert protected her. He did. Now you're saying Anna needed protection from him? Both things can be true. How? Thomas looked exhausted. Robert changed. Fear changed him. The people he worked for changed him. There were times Claire didn't know which version of Robert would come through the door. I understood enough that I stopped pushing for details. So Claire wanted to leave. Yes. And Robert wouldn't let her. Not at first. Is that why you wanted Robert to disappear? Thomas nodded slowly. Claire asked me to help her take Anna somewhere safe. Robert discovered the plan. And then he did something none of us expected. What? He agreed. That surprised me. Robert agreed to let Claire leave. He finally understood what his life was doing to them. He came to me 3 days before our wedding, gave me the trunk, and said he was going to disappear. He wanted everyone connected to Victor to believe he had taken the evidence with him. Claire and Anna would be free. But he didn't disappear. No. Why? Thomas stared into the distance. Because someone found out. 3 weeks after our wedding, Robert called Thomas late at night. He said the plan had been exposed. Someone knew Claire intended to leave. Someone knew about the evidence. Robert asked Thomas to come to an abandoned farmhouse outside Westfield. The house that later burned. You went? Yes. What happened? Thomas's voice became quieter. When I arrived, Robert was already there. Alone. Thomas didn't answer. Thomas. Was he alone? No. My heart began pounding. Who was with him? Thomas looked at me for a long time. Then he said a name I hadn't expected. Margaret. I stared at him. Claire's sister. Yes. What was Margaret doing there? Trying to stop Robert from leaving. Nothing fit anymore. Margaret claimed to blame Thomas for Robert's death. Claire wanted Robert gone. Robert planned to disappear. Yet Margaret was trying to stop him. Why? Thomas lowered his voice. Because Robert wasn't the only person planning to disappear that night. Who else? Before Thomas could answer, headlights swept across our kitchen window. Car had pulled into the driveway. Thomas immediately stood. It was nearly 11 at night. He moved toward the front door, but I caught his arm. Are you expecting someone? No. The car engine stopped. A door opened. Thomas told me to stay inside. Naturally, I followed him. A man stood beside a dark sedan at the edge of our driveway. He looked perhaps 60, with silver hair and a heavy coat. I had never seen him before. Thomas apparently had. Because the moment he recognized the visitor, his entire body became rigid. You shouldn't be here, Thomas said. The man looked past him toward me. So that's Evelyn. I felt the same cold sensation I had experienced years earlier when Margaret first said my name. Thomas stepped between us. What do you want? The man smiled without warmth. The same thing I've wanted for years. His eyes moved toward the upstairs window. Robert's trunk. I looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the stranger. Then he said the name. Victor. The man I had been told might already be dead was standing in our driveway. I had imagined Victor many times after Thomas first mentioned his name, but the man standing in our driveway looked nothing like the figure my imagination had created. There was nothing obviously frightening about him. He wasn't enormous. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He looked like someone who might sit beside you at church or hold the door open at a grocery store. That ordinary appearance frightened me more than anything else. Thomas moved another step forward, blocking Victor's view of me. Leave, he said. Victor slipped his hands into his coat pockets. You always were loyal, Thomas. I'll give you that. You have 5 seconds. Victor smiled faintly. And then what? You'll call the police. Thomas didn't answer. Victor's smile widened. That's what I thought. I should have gone inside. Thomas told me twice to do exactly that. But after years of being protected from a truth everyone else seemed to understand, I refused to leave. What do you want from my husband? Yes. Victor looked directly at me. Something that doesn't belong to him. Robert gave it to me, Thomas said. Robert stole it, Victor replied. That makes it mine. Documents aren't yours simply because they prove what you did. For the first time, Victor's expression hardened. Be careful. Thomas didn't move. I'm not 25 anymore. Neither am I. The two men stared at each other, and I realized this wasn't their first meeting. You told me you'd never met him, I said. Thomas's shoulders dropped slightly. Victor looked amused. He told you that. Go home, Victor. Victor ignored him. Your husband and I met exactly once, Mrs. Carter. Very long time ago. Ask him where. I looked at Thomas. He said nothing. The farmhouse. Yes. Victor's eyes shifted toward me. She knows about that. Enough. No, Victor said quietly. If she knew enough, she wouldn't be standing beside you. Thomas took another step toward him. Leave my family out of this. I've left your family out of it for years. You broke into my house. Victor's expression changed. That wasn't me. Thomas seemed surprised. Then who? Victor glanced toward the upstairs window. If I knew, I wouldn't be here asking whether you still have the trunk. For the first time the situation changed. Victor wasn't simply looking for the trunk. He was worried someone else might have found it first. Who else wants it? Yes. Victor looked at Thomas. Tell her. Thomas remained silent. Victor shook his head. Still protecting everyone. Even after all these years. Tell me what? I demanded. Victor considered the question before answering. Robert didn't collect those papers alone. Thomas's jaw tightened. Stop. Why? Claire is dead. Robert is dead. Half the people involved are dead. Anna isn't. At the mention of Anna, Victor's expression softened in a way I didn't expect. No, he said. Anna isn't. You stay away from her. I've never gone near her. And you never will. Victor nodded. On that, Thomas, we agree. I couldn't understand any of it. The man Thomas had described as the source of Robert's fear was now standing in our driveway, agreeing that Anna should be protected. Who helped Robert collect the evidence? Yes. Victor looked at me. Claire. Thomas closed his eyes. There it was. The answer he had refused to give me. Claire was involved. Not the way you think, Thomas said quickly. Victor gave a quiet laugh. She was much more involved than Robert. That's enough. No, Thomas. It stopped being enough when somebody started searching houses. Victor turned toward me. Robert wasn't brave enough to build a case against us. Claire was. My thoughts raced back through everything Thomas had told me. Claire's name in the papers. Robert's fear. Margaret's anger. The plan to disappear. Why? Victor's expression became serious. Because she wanted out. Out of what? Robert's life. Or operation. Westfield. Everything. Thomas stepped closer. You don't get to tell her Claire's story. Someone should. I looked at Thomas. Let him. Evelyn. Let him. Victor explained that Claire discovered what Robert was doing not long after Anna was born. At first she begged him to stop. When he couldn't, she began quietly keeping copies of anything she found. Receipts, names, addresses, letters, dates. She believed evidence was the only protection she and Anna had if Robert's associates ever came after them. Robert found out. Yes. Eventually. And he helped her. Victor shook his head. At first he was furious. Then something happened that changed him. What? Victor looked at Thomas. Thomas answered. Someone threatened Anna. Silence settled over the driveway. Victor's voice became quieter. That was the line Robert wouldn't cross. For all his mistakes, Robert apparently loved his daughter. When he realized his choices had placed Anna in danger, he joined Claire in gathering evidence. The trunk became their insurance. If anything happened to Claire or Anna, copies of the documents would reach people who could expose everyone involved. Then why give it to Thomas? Because nobody knew Thomas existed, Victor said. That made sense. Thomas had left Westfield. He wasn't part of the operation. He had no official connection to Robert's activities. He was the perfect person to hide the evidence. Except you found out, I said. Victor nodded. Eventually. How? He didn't answer. Thomas did. Margaret. I stared at him. Margaret told Victor. Victor laughed once. Not intentionally. Thomas explained that Margaret knew pieces of Claire's plan but not everything. She knew Robert had given something important to Thomas. After the fire, Margaret confronted people connected to Robert, accusing them of causing his death. In doing so, she revealed that evidence existed somewhere. And you assumed Thomas had it, I said. Not immediately, Victor replied. It took years. Then why didn't you take it? Victor looked at Thomas. Because your husband made me an offer. I turned toward him. What offer? Thomas looked uncomfortable. Victor answered for him. If anything happened to Claire, Anna, you, or your children, copies of the papers would be sent to several different places. I stared at my husband. You made copies. Some. Where are they? I never told Victor. Victor nodded. And that's why everyone remained alive. The trunk wasn't simply a collection of secrets. It had been protecting us. Protecting Claire. Protecting Anna. Perhaps even protecting our children. Then why come here now? Yes. Victor looked toward the dark road. Because somebody else is looking for those documents, and whoever it is doesn't understand the agreement Thomas and I made. Who? I don't know. Margaret. No. Anna. Thomas immediately shook his head. Anna doesn't know the trunk exists. Victor studied him. Are you certain? Thomas hesitated. That hesitation frightened me. Victor reached into his coat. Thomas moved instantly in front of me. Victor stopped. Relax. He slowly removed an envelope. This arrived at my house 3 days ago. He handed it to Thomas. Thomas opened it. Inside was a photograph. I looked over his shoulder. Showed our house. The photograph had been taken from across the street. On the back, someone had written, "I know where Robert left it." Below that was another sentence. "The girl deserves the truth." Thomas read it twice. Then he looked at Victor. When was this taken? Recently. Who sent it? No idea. Thomas handed the photograph to me. The girl, Anna. She was no longer a child. By then she was a young woman living somewhere beyond Westfield, trying to build a life without knowing that half a dozen adults had spent years protecting her from her own history. Victor walked back toward his car. "Move the trunk," he said. Thomas didn't respond. Victor opened his door. "And Thomas." "What?" "If whoever sent that photograph comes back, don't assume they're trying to destroy the evidence. What else would they want?" Victor looked at him over the roof of the car. "Maybe they want Anna to see it." Then he drove away. Thomas and I stood in the driveway long after his taillights disappeared. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me from the beginning. What truth are all of you protecting Anna from? Thomas stared at the photograph. Then, for the first time, he gave me a real answer. Robert Hale wasn't Anna's biological father. I couldn't speak. Thomas continued. Claire knew. Did Robert? Yes. Does Margaret? Yes. Does Victor? Apparently. Does Anna? Thomas shook his head. No. My mind immediately returned to the question I had asked him years earlier. Was Anna your daughter? Thomas had sworn she wasn't. I looked at him now. If Robert wasn't her father, who was? Thomas's expression became almost unbearable to watch. I promised Claire I would never tell Anna. Thomas. I can't. After everything. He shook his head. That secret isn't mine. Then he went inside. But as I followed him, something Victor had said continued echoing through my mind. Claire had collected the evidence. Robert had protected it. Thomas had hidden it. Margaret wanted it. Someone had broken into our home looking for it. And somehow, everything came back to the identity of Anna's real father. Years later, when I finally opened the trunk, the first document I removed was Anna's birth certificate. The name written in the space marked father was Robert Hale. But underneath it was another document. A handwritten confession from Claire. And the first line read, "If Anna is reading this, then Evelyn finally opened the trunk." After Victor left, I expected Thomas to move the trunk immediately. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table until nearly dawn with the photograph of our house in front of him. Every few minutes he picked it up, studied the handwriting on the back, and put it down again. I asked whether he recognized the writing. He said no. I asked whether we should contact the police. He said there was nothing useful we could tell them without explaining everything else. Finally, just before sunrise, Thomas looked at me and said, "I'm going to make sure you can find the key." I didn't understand why that frightened me so much. "You can give it to me now." He shook his head. "Not yet." Why not? Because if you have it, you'll eventually open the trunk. Maybe I should. Thomas reached across the table and took my hand. One day maybe. But not while Anna still has a chance to live without carrying any of this. The trunk remained in our house. Thomas didn't move it because, as he later explained, moving it might reveal where it was. Instead, he strengthened the storage room door, replaced the trunk's lock, and quietly made arrangements I wouldn't fully understand until after his death. Then life continued. That was perhaps the strangest part of everything. There were no more nighttime visitors. No more break-ins. Victor disappeared from our lives as suddenly as he had entered them. Margaret never returned to our home. Anna remained a name that surfaced only occasionally. The children grew up. Michael married. Sarah moved across the country. Daniel became a father. Thomas and I became grandparents. Years accumulated around the secret until the frightening events of the 1970s began to feel like something that had happened to another family. Once, sometime in the late 1980s, I asked Thomas whether Anna was happy. He was repairing a cabinet hinge in the kitchen. He stopped turning the screwdriver. I think so. You still know where she is? Yes. Do you see her? No. Write to her. Not anymore. Why? Thomas smiled sadly. Because sometimes protecting someone means accepting that they don't need you. Anna had built a life. She had married. She had children of her own. According to Thomas, she believed Robert Hale had been her father, Claire had been her mother, and Margaret had been the aunt who raised her after tragedy took both parents too early. The secret seemed destined to die quietly. Then Thomas became ill. First it was nothing dramatic. He became tired more easily. He lost weight. He blamed age and work. Eventually I convinced him to see a doctor. What followed were months of appointments, tests, treatments, cautious optimism, and finally the kind of silence from doctors that tells you hope has changed shape. One evening, when Thomas and I both understood there might not be much time left, he asked me to help him upstairs. He hadn't entered the storage room in years. Open the door. The trunk remained beneath the same old wool blanket. Thomas sat in a chair while I uncovered it. He ran his hand across the wood. I should have burned all of this 40 years ago. Margaret told me not to. Thomas smiled faintly. She always thought the truth solved everything. Doesn't it? No. Sometimes truth arrives too early and becomes another kind of cruelty. I sat beside him. Thomas, who was Anna's father. He looked at me. Even after all those decades, he wouldn't say. Instead, he reached into his pocket and gave me a small envelope. My name was written across the front. What's this? Instructions. For the trunk. He nodded. When do I open it? Thomas looked toward the window. If Anna ever comes looking for answers. And if she doesn't, then keep it locked. Forever. He thought for a moment. No. That surprised me. Then until when? Until you're certain you're opening it because the truth matters more than the promise. I felt tears filling my eyes. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. I placed the envelope in my pocket. Thomas put his hand over mine. There is something else. What? If you open it, Evelyn, you're going to learn things about me that will hurt. My throat tightened. About Claire. Yes. Did you lie when you said Anna wasn't your daughter? No. Did you betray me? Thomas shook his head. Never. Then what could hurt me? He looked at the trunk. You're going to discover how much of our marriage I spent protecting a life that existed before you. I didn't know what to say. Thomas's voice cracked. And you may wonder whether that means I loved you less. I took his face in my hands. Did you? No. His answer was immediate. Then I won't wonder. But I did. Years later I would. Thomas died the following winter. We had been married for 46 years. After the funeral, our children stayed with me for several days. The house filled with casseroles, flowers, relatives, neighbors, stories, photographs, and all the strange activity that surrounds death because nobody knows what to do with silence. Eventually everyone went home. I was alone. That first night, I opened the envelope Thomas had given me. Inside was a single piece of paper. The message was short. Evelyn, if you're reading this, I couldn't tell you everything myself. Sorry. The key is behind the photograph of us on our first anniversary. If Anna ever asks about Robert, Claire, or the fire, give her the truth. If she never asks, use your judgment. Whatever you decide, know that loving you was the most honest thing I ever did. I cried until morning. Then I found the key. It was exactly where Thomas said. Carried it upstairs. I removed the blanket from the trunk. I sat in front of it for almost an hour. And then I put the key back into the envelope. Couldn't do it. Not yet. 1 year passed. Then 5. Then 10. The trunk remained locked. By then, almost everyone connected to its secret was gone. Claire had been dead for decades. Robert even longer. Margaret died several years after Thomas. I never heard from Victor again. Anna, wherever she was, never contacted me. I began believing Thomas had been right. Perhaps some truths should be allowed to disappear. Then came the 11th year. My granddaughter Lily had been helping me clean Thomas's old desk. She loved old photographs and insisted I had kept far too many papers. Late that afternoon, she came into the kitchen holding a photograph. "Grandma!" I looked up. Who is this little girl standing beside Grandpa? My heart stopped. Lily placed the photograph on the table. Thomas was young. Beside him stood Anna, the same little girl from Westfield. I turned the photograph over. For words were written on the back. Tell Evelyn the truth. But there was something I hadn't noticed when Lily first handed it to me. Beneath those words, written much more faintly in pencil, was a date. The date was 3 days before Thomas died. Thomas had placed that photograph inside his desk himself. He wanted me to find it. That night, after Lily went home, I took the brass key from the envelope, climbed the stairs. I removed the blanket. And after more than 50 years of questions, I finally opened my husband's trunk. The lock clicked. The lid rose. The smell of old paper filled the room. Inside were photographs, letters, legal documents, newspaper clippings, Robert's notebook, Anna's red scarf, and dozens of envelopes tied with faded string. But one envelope sat on top of everything else. It had not yellowed like the others. Thomas had added it much later. Across the front were 3 words. For Evelyn first. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a letter from my husband. The first sentence read, "Evie, before you read Claire's confession, you need to know what I did the night Robert died." I sat on the floor beside the open trunk with Thomas's letter in my hands and listened to the rain tapping against the upstairs window. 11 years had passed since his death. Yet seeing his handwriting made the distance between us disappear. For a moment, I could almost hear him downstairs opening cabinets, looking for the coffee he could never remember I kept in the same place. I wanted desperately to close the envelope, lower the lid, turn the key, and preserve the version of my husband I had carried through more than half a century. But Thomas himself had placed that letter on top. Whatever he had been unable to say while alive, he had finally chosen to say after death. So I began reading. "Evie, before you read Claire's confession, you need to know what I did the night Robert died. I have spent most of my life believing that if I had made one different decision, Robert might have walked out of that house alive. I don't know whether that's true. I only know I was there, and I left without him." Stop. That single sentence explained the guilt I had seen in Thomas for decades. Continued. Thomas wrote that Robert called him shortly before midnight, 3 weeks after our wedding. Robert sounded terrified and told Thomas to come alone to the farmhouse outside Westfield. When Thomas arrived, Margaret was already there. She had discovered Claire's plan to leave and believed Robert was abandoning his family to protect himself. Margaret had gone to confront him. But Robert wasn't trying to escape alone. He was trying to make everyone believe he was. The real plan was for Claire and Anna to leave separately the following morning. Robert intended to drive in the opposite direction, deliberately drawing attention away from them. Once Claire and Anna were safe, Robert planned to disappear. Why didn't Margaret understand? I whispered to the empty room. Thomas's letter answered almost immediately. Robert hadn't told her. He trusted almost no one. That secrecy destroyed everything. Margaret confronted Robert inside the farmhouse. They argued. Thomas arrived in the middle of it and tried to explain the plan without revealing where Claire and Anna were going. Margaret refused to believe them. Then another car appeared outside. Victor. My hands tightened around the letter. Thomas wrote that Victor entered alone. He knew about the trunk. He knew Robert had given it to someone. But he didn't yet know Thomas had it. Victor demanded the documents. Robert claimed he had hidden them somewhere no one would ever find. Victor didn't believe him. The argument escalated. Thomas's next paragraph was difficult to read because his handwriting became uneven. Robert told Victor that copies had already been made. He said if Claire or Anna were harmed, everything would be exposed. Victor told him he was bluffing. Robert laughed. I remember that laugh because it was the last time I heard it. According to Thomas, Victor left the house without touching anyone. That surprised me. For decades, I had assumed Victor somehow caused the fire. He didn't. At least not directly. After Victor left, Margaret followed. She was furious with Robert and Thomas and wanted nothing more to do with either of them. That left the two old friends alone. Thomas begged Robert to leave. Robert refused. He believed Victor would watch Thomas's movements. If they left together, Victor might realize Thomas was involved and eventually discover the location of the trunk. So Robert told Thomas to drive away alone. Thomas refused. They argued. Finally Robert said something that remained with my husband for the rest of his life. You have a wife now. Go home to her. I've already ruined one family. I'm not ruining yours. Thomas left. 20 minutes later, the farmhouse caught fire. I lowered the letter. For years, Thomas had carried the guilt of leaving his friend alone. But there was more. I drove less than 5 miles before I saw the sky behind me turning orange, Thomas wrote. I went back. When Thomas returned, part of the farmhouse was already burning. He tried to get inside. That explained the smoke on his clothes and the cut on his hand when he came home to me the following morning. But he couldn't reach Robert. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The official conclusion was that the fire had started accidentally. Thomas never believed it. Neither did Margaret. But Victor had left before the fire began. And Thomas had found something outside the farmhouse that complicated everything. Gasoline can. I stared at those words. Thomas wrote that he found it near the back of the property, partly hidden in weeds. He didn't tell the police. I couldn't understand why. Then I read the next paragraph. The can belonged to Claire. I stopped again. Claire. Thomas recognized it because he had seen the same container in the trunk of Claire's car earlier that week. Had Claire been at the farmhouse? Thomas didn't know. He hid the can before the police arrived. That was the thing he had done. Not start the fire. Not hurt Robert. He had hidden possible evidence because he was afraid it would lead investigators to Claire. I felt anger rising inside me despite the fact that Thomas had been dead 11 years. You should have told them, I whispered. His letter seemed to answer me. I know what you're thinking, Evie. You're right. I should have given it to the police. I was young, frightened, and convinced Claire would be blamed. I had promised Robert the first would protect her and Anna, so I made the worst decision of my life. I hid it. Thomas later returned and retrieved the container after the investigation ended. It was inside the trunk, wrapped in the cloth bundle I had seen decades earlier. I looked down. There it was. I didn't touch it. Instead, I continued reading. Thomas spent years trying to determine whether Claire had caused the fire. She always denied it. Robert's death destroyed her. If she was responsible, Thomas wrote, she carried the guilt convincingly. Then, shortly before Claire died, she gave Thomas a confession. Not a confession to starting the fire. Confession about Anna. Thomas's letter ended there. Everything else belongs to Claire. I promised her I would never speak these words while she or Margaret were alive. Perhaps I kept that promise too long. Read her letter. Then decide what Anna deserves to know. And Evelyn, whatever you discover next, remember this. Anna was never my daughter. I never betrayed our marriage. But I did love Claire once before I knew you. I spent years protecting her because I confused guilt with responsibility. I understand that now. If that hurt you, I am sorry. You were my wife, my home, and the person I should have trusted with the truth. I pressed the letter against my chest. For 11 years I had missed Thomas. In that moment I was angry with him. Strangely, the anger felt good. It made him human again. Not the perfect dead husband everyone remembered at funerals and family gatherings. Thomas, stubborn, loyal, afraid, sometimes foolish. A good man capable of bad decisions. I placed his letter beside me and searched through the trunk. There were dozens of documents. Robert's notebook. Photographs of equipment and buildings. Old receipts. Copies of letters. Newspaper articles about the fire. Several photographs of Anna growing up that Claire must have sent Thomas. Then I found an envelope sealed with wax. On the front. For Anna. Only when the truth can no longer hurt her. Underneath, in different handwriting, Thomas had added, Evelyn decides. I almost laughed through my tears. Of course you left it to me. And broke the seal. Inside were 14 handwritten pages. The first was dated only months before Claire died. My dearest Anna, it began. If you are reading this, then someone finally decided you deserved the truth about the people who loved you badly, loved you imperfectly, and sometimes loved you enough to lie. I read slowly. Claire wrote about Robert, about Thomas, about Margaret, about Victor, about the years of fear. Then I reached the part everyone had spent decades hiding. When I met Robert, I was already carrying you. I stopped breathing. Anna had been conceived before Claire and Robert were together. Robert knew. He married Claire anyway. That was why Thomas had always insisted Robert was not Anna's biological father, while still speaking of him as the man who had protected her. Continued. Robert gave you his name because your real father could never safely give you his. The next sentence contained the name. I read it once. Then again. Suddenly Victor's behavior made sense. His concern for Anna. His agreement with Thomas that she should be protected. His insistence that he had never gone near her. His knowledge of details he should never have known. Anna's biological father was Victor. I dropped the letter into my lap. For more than 50 years, everyone had been protecting Anna from that truth. But Claire's confession wasn't finished. And the next page revealed something even Thomas had apparently never known. Victor had not discovered Robert's evidence by accident. Claire had told him about the trunk herself. Not because she trusted him. Because she had made a deal. Leave Anna alone forever. And the evidence would remain hidden. If Victor ever approached his daughter, the papers would be released. The trunk had never simply protected Anna from Victor. It had forced Victor to stay away from her. Then I reached Claire's account of the night of the fire. My hands began shaking again. Claire admitted she had gone to the farmhouse. The gasoline container was hers. But she insisted she hadn't started the fire. She had arrived after Thomas left. Robert was still alive. They spoke. They argued. And then Robert told her something that made her leave immediately. Claire wrote the exact words Robert had said. Take Anna and go. Margaret knows who her father is. I stared at the page. Margaret had always known. That wasn't surprising. But Claire's next sentence was. And Robert told me Margaret had gone to find Victor. The timeline Thomas believed was wrong. Margaret hadn't simply driven away after the argument. She had gone after Victor. And according to Claire, Margaret returned to the farmhouse before the fire began. I looked across the open trunk. Somewhere among those papers was Robert's notebook. If Thomas had preserved everything, there might be one final record of what happened that night. I searched until I found a small black notebook tied with string. Most pages contained dates, names, numbers, and notes I couldn't understand. Near the end, however, several pages had been folded together. Inside was a loose piece of paper. It wasn't Robert's handwriting. It was Margaret's. At the top she had written, "Thomas must never see this." And beneath it, "I was the last person to see Robert alive." For several minutes, I couldn't make myself unfold the rest of Margaret's letter. I had spent most of my adult life thinking of her as the angry woman who appeared at our house after Claire died, demanded the trunk, accused Thomas of hiding the truth, and warned me never to burn what was inside. I had believed her anger came from grief. Now I was holding a confession she had apparently hidden among Robert's papers without Thomas ever knowing it existed. The first sentence kept pulling my eyes back. I was the last person to see Robert alive. Finally, I unfolded the page. Margaret wrote that she had lied for decades about the night of the fire. She had indeed been at the farmhouse when Thomas arrived. She had argued with Robert. She had left before Thomas did. All of that was true. What Thomas didn't know was that she returned. Margaret had driven after Victor because she wanted to confront him about Anna. Claire had told her the truth years earlier. Victor was Anna's biological father. Margaret hated him for disappearing from Claire's life and hated Robert for bringing dangerous men around the child. She believed both men had destroyed her sister's future in different ways. She found Victor several miles from the farmhouse. They argued beside the road. Victor insisted he had no intention of harming Anna. He wanted Robert's evidence and nothing else. Margaret didn't believe him. Then she drove back. By the time she returned to the farmhouse, Thomas was gone. Claire had apparently already been there and left as well. Robert was alone. Margaret entered through the kitchen. The argument began again. Robert told her Claire and Anna would leave the following morning. Margaret accused him of abandoning them. Robert tried to explain that his disappearance was the only way to keep attention away from Anna. Then Margaret noticed something. Smoke. Not flames. Smoke. It was coming from the rear room. Robert ran toward it. Margaret followed. An old lamp had fallen near a stack of newspapers and cardboard boxes. Fire was beginning to spread along the wall. There was no deliberate attack. No mysterious stranger hiding outside. No planned destruction of evidence. The fire really had begun accidentally. But then came the part Margaret had hidden. She and Robert could have escaped immediately. Instead, Robert ran upstairs. "Why?" I whispered. Margaret's letter answered. There was another set of documents inside the house. Robert had kept a small group of papers separate from the trunk, the documents containing the information that could identify Victor as Anna's biological father. Robert wanted them destroyed. Margaret begged him to leave. He refused. She followed him part way up the stairs, but smoke was already filling the hallway. Robert found the papers. He threw them toward Margaret and told her to take them outside. Then part of the ceiling collapsed between them. Margaret ran. Robert didn't make it out. Closed my eyes. For decades, Thomas blamed himself for leaving Robert. Claire feared she had somehow contributed to his death. Margaret blamed Thomas publicly. But Margaret had been carrying her own guilt. She had been there. She had escaped. Robert had not. The letter continued. I blamed Thomas because blaming him was easier than admitting that I had walked away from that house while Robert was still inside. I told myself Thomas should have stayed. I told myself Victor caused everything. I told myself Claire's choices had brought us there. But the truth is simpler and harder. Robert went back for those papers because he wanted Anna protected. I ran because I was afraid. I have hated myself for surviving ever since. I lowered the letter. Suddenly I understood Margaret differently. Her bitterness. Her obsession with the trunk. Her anger toward Thomas. We had all been living inside different versions of the same tragedy. Then I reached the final paragraph. Margaret wrote that she had hidden her confession inside Robert's notebook during one of the rare occasions Thomas allowed her access to the trunk after Claire's death. She assumed he would eventually find it. He never did. But there was another reason she wanted the trunk preserved. The papers Robert threw toward her that night had not all been destroyed. Margaret had kept one. She placed it inside the notebook with her confession. I searched between the remaining pages. There it was. A folded document, brittle with age. The top was a name. Victor's full name. Below it were dates and handwritten notes documenting payments Claire had received before Anna's birth. But one line mattered more than all the others. It referred to a private agreement. Victor had known Claire was pregnant. He had offered money. Claire refused it. Robert knew the truth before marrying her. And despite everything else he later became involved in, Robert gave Anna his surname willingly. He had chosen to be her father. That realization changed the entire story for me. For years, I had thought the great secret was the identity of Anna's biological father. It wasn't. The real secret was that fatherhood had never been the question. Victor gave Anna life. Robert gave her his name. Claire protected her. Margaret raised her. Thomas guarded the truth. Every adult around Anna had made terrible mistakes, but nearly every one of those mistakes had eventually become tangled with the same desire. Give that little girl a chance to grow up outside the consequences of their choices. I sat beside the trunk until sunrise. When morning light entered the storage room, I had read almost everything. There were no hidden fortunes. No second family belonging to Thomas. No sensational betrayal waiting at the bottom. There were simply the remains of several imperfect lives. Letters from Claire thanking Thomas for helping Anna. Photographs Margaret had secretly sent him as Anna grew older. Robert's notes. Thomas's copies of documents. The red scarf. And near the bottom I found one final envelope. It was addressed to Anna. Unlike Claire's confession, this one was in Thomas's handwriting. Opened it. Dear Anna, if Evelyn gives you this letter, then she has decided you are ready. You knew me as Uncle Thomas when you were a child. I disappeared from your life because the adults around you believed distance would keep you safe. I hope we were right. There is something I want you to understand before you read anything else in this trunk. Robert knew you weren't his biological daughter. He knew before he married your mother. He chose you anyway. Whatever mistakes he made afterward, never let anyone use the truth of your birth to take your father away from you. Robert was your father because he decided to be. I had to stop reading. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Even after death, even while revealing a secret, he was trying to protect someone from the sharpest edge of it. The letter ended simply. Your mother loved you. Robert loved you. Margaret loved you. And from a distance, so did I. Uncle Thomas. I folded it carefully. Then I looked at the photograph Lily had found. Tell Evelyn the truth. Finally understood. Thomas hadn't wanted me to open the trunk simply because he was dead. He wanted me to decide whether the reason for keeping it locked still existed. Anna was no longer a child. She was a woman with grown children of her own. Victor, if he was still alive, would have been extremely old. Everyone else was gone. The secret was no longer protecting Anna from danger. Now it was only preventing her from knowing her own history. Thomas had told me exactly when to open the trunk all those years ago. Until keeping the secret becomes crueler than telling the truth. I knew what I had to do. But there was a problem. I hadn't seen Anna since she was a little girl. I didn't know where she lived. I didn't even know whether she would want to hear from the widow of a man she barely remembered. Then I looked again through Thomas's final envelope. Behind his letter was a small card I had overlooked. There was an address. And beneath it a telephone number. Thomas had known where Anna was until the end. Carried the card downstairs. For almost an hour, it sat beside my telephone. I walked past it repeatedly. Finally, I picked up the receiver and dialed. A woman answered after the fourth ring. Hello. Her voice was older, of course. But something about it took me instantly back to that sidewalk in 1969. A little girl in a blue coat. A red scarf held against her chest. Is this Anna Hale? There was a pause. Yes. My mouth went dry. My name is Evelyn Carter. Silence. Then Anna said something I never expected. Thomas's wife. I gripped the telephone. You remember me? Another pause. I've been waiting for you to call. I couldn't speak. Anna continued. Margaret told me before she died that someday you might find a trunk. I looked toward the ceiling, toward the open storage room upstairs. Anna, did you open it? Yes. She became quiet. Then she asked the question that finally ended more than 50 years of secrecy. Did Thomas leave something in there for me? Closed my eyes. Yes, I said. He did. When can I come? And 3 days later a car stopped outside my house. A woman in her 60s stepped out. For a moment, I saw Claire in her face. Then I saw the little girl from Westfield. Anna stood at the bottom of my porch steps. Neither of us knew what to say. Finally, she looked at me and smiled through tears. Hello, Evelyn. Open the door. Come inside, Anna. Upstairs the trunk was waiting. Anna stood in my hallway for several seconds before stepping inside. I had imagined that moment repeatedly during the 3 days between our telephone conversation and her arrival. I imagined embracing her. I imagined immediately telling her everything. I imagined her asking questions faster than I could answer them. None of those things happened. Instead, 2 older women who had once stood on opposite sides of a secret simply looked at each other. Anna was 63 by then. Her dark hair had become mostly silver, but I recognized her eyes immediately. They were Claire's eyes. She carried a small handbag in one hand and an old photograph in the other. I brought something, she said. She handed me the photograph. It showed Thomas kneeling beside her when she was perhaps 8 years old. Around Anna's neck was the red scarf. I kept that picture all these years, she said. Margaret didn't know. I looked at her. The scarf is upstairs. Anna's expression changed. He kept it. For the rest of his life. We climbed the stairs slowly. When Anna reached the storage room doorway and saw the open trunk, she stopped. She didn't approach it immediately. That's it, she whispered. That's it. She stared at the dark wood as though looking at something from a dream. Margaret talked about it near the end of her life. She never told me what was inside. She only said Thomas had protected something that belonged partly to my mother. I pulled a chair beside the trunk. There's more than that. Anna looked at me. Is it bad? It was such a simple question that I struggled to answer. Some of it is painful. But I don't think the truth itself is bad. She nodded and sat down. I gave her Thomas's letter first. She recognized his handwriting immediately. Uncle Thomas. The name came from her mouth with such affection that I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Anna read silently. When she reached the part where Thomas wrote that Robert had known she wasn't biologically his, her hands stopped moving. She looked at me but I said nothing. She returned to the letter. By the end, tears were running down her cheeks. She folded it carefully and held it against her chest. I always wondered why he disappeared. Thomas. She nodded. When I was little, he would visit sometimes. Margaret hated it. I didn't understand why. Then one day he stopped coming. I thought I'd done something wrong. He thought staying away would protect you. Anna smiled sadly. Adults tell themselves that a lot, don't they? I couldn't disagree. Then I gave her Claire's confession. This was written by your mother. Anna stared at the envelope. My mother? Yes. She didn't open it immediately. I barely remember her. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Thomas remembered her. Anna looked at me carefully. I know. I was surprised. You know. Margaret told me they had been close before Thomas married you. She never explained how close. They cared about each other when they were young. Did that bother you? I thought about the question. For a long time, yes. And now? I looked at the trunk. Now I think there are people we love at different times for different reasons. What matters is what we choose to build. Anna nodded. Then she opened Claire's letter. I stayed beside her while she read. When she reached Victor's name, she stopped. Her face became completely still. I watched decades of assumptions rearranging themselves behind her eyes. Victor was my father. Biologically. She read the sentence again. Did Thomas know? Yes. Did Robert? Yes. Her voice broke slightly. Robert knew before he married my mother. Yes. Anna lowered the pages. For several moments she stared at the floor. Then she asked, "Did he love me?" I reached into the trunk and removed Thomas's letter again. Thomas wanted you to understand that before anything else. Anna closed her eyes. He chose me. Yes. A strange smile appeared through her tears. Then he was my father. There was nothing else to say. Yes, I replied. He was. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the trunk together. Some documents meant nothing to either of us. Others filled gaps Anna had carried throughout her life. She found photographs of Claire she had never seen. Robert holding her as a baby. Margaret standing beside Claire at a picnic. Thomas repairing a bicycle while little Anna watched. There were birthday cards Claire had written but apparently never sent. Notes Thomas had kept. Newspaper clippings. Receipts. Evidence of fear, guilt, loyalty, and love preserved on yellowing paper. Then Anna found the red scarf. She lifted it from the trunk with both hands. The fabric had faded from bright red to something closer to rust. I remember this. Thomas bought it for you. I know. Her answer surprised me. You remember that day. Anna smiled. Not all of it. I remember him giving it to me. I remember seeing you across the street. My heart tightened. You remember me. I remember children standing beside you. I remember Thomas looking frightened. I laughed softly. He was. I thought you were angry with me. Oh, Anna. I was a child. I didn't understand. You had nothing to do with my anger. She ran her fingers across the scarf. Margaret took it away afterward. Claire eventually returned it to Thomas. Anna nodded. That sounds like Margaret. For the first time that day we both laughed. It was a small laugh, but it changed something between us. The trunk stopped feeling like a grave. It became an archive. Near sunset, Anna asked about the fire. I gave her Margaret's confession. That was the hardest part. Anna read slowly. She cried when she learned Robert had gone back upstairs. She cried again when she discovered Margaret had blamed Thomas because she couldn't forgive herself for escaping. When she finished, she sat silently for a long time. All those years, she finally said, Margaret spoke about Robert as though she hated him. Maybe hatred was easier than grief. Anna nodded. She kept his photograph beside her bed. I hadn't known that. We sat together until the room grew dark. Eventually Anna asked, "What happens to all of this now?" I looked at the trunk. For more than 50 years, everyone had treated its contents as dangerous. Now almost everyone involved was gone. "It's yours." Anna immediately shook her head. "No. Thomas kept it for you. He kept it for all of us." I didn't understand. Anna touched Thomas's letter. "This is part of your life too, Evelyn. Your marriage. Your children grew up in the same house as this secret. Thomas carried it while he was your husband. I don't want to take that away." "What do you want?" She thought for a moment. "The photographs of my mother and Robert. Their letters. Margaret's confession. Thomas's letter to me. Of course. The rest." She looked around the storage room. "I think Thomas chose the right person to decide." I laughed. "I was afraid you'd say that." Before Anna left, we carried the trunk downstairs together. It was heavier than either of us expected, so we stopped several times and laughed at ourselves. Something that had frightened me for most of my life had become simply an old wooden box two elderly women were struggling to carry down a staircase. The front door, Anna hugged me. It was the first time we had ever embraced. "Thank you." "For what?" "For opening it." I looked toward the trunk. "I almost didn't." "I know." "How?" Anna smiled. "Because Thomas knew you." She walked toward her car then stopped. Evelyn. Yes. Do you regret opening it? I thought about Thomas. About Claire. Robert. Margaret. Victor. About all the years I had imagined secrets worse than the truth. No, I said. Anna nodded. Neither do I. Then she drove away. I stood on the porch until her car disappeared. That night, I returned to the trunk one final time. There was almost nothing left I hadn't examined. But beneath the old cloth lining, my fingers found something hard. A thin envelope had slipped beneath a wooden panel at the bottom. Pulled it free. It was addressed to me. Thomas's handwriting. Again. I smiled despite myself. You really couldn't make this easy, could you? The envelope contained only one page. No revelations. No new secrets. Just a letter Thomas must have written near the end of his life. Evie, if you've reached this letter, then you know everything I was too afraid to tell you. I don't expect you to forgive every decision I made. Some were wrong. Some were cowardly. Some I would make differently if life gave me another chance. But there is one thing I would never change. I would still walk into that bakery on a rainy Thursday morning. I would still order 2 cinnamon rolls and black coffee. I would still wait for the storm just so I could stand there long enough to speak to you. I began crying before I reached the final lines. People will tell you that marriage means knowing everything about another person. I don't believe that anymore. We never know everything. We simply keep choosing each other while slowly discovering how complicated another human being can be. Thank you for choosing me for 46 years. Whatever you decide to do with the trunk, don't let my secrets become the biggest thing you remember about me. Remember our kitchen. Remember the children. Remember getting lost on that trip to Tennessee because I refused to ask for directions. Remember dancing in the living room when the radio stopped working and you sang terribly. Remember the ordinary things. Those were the real ones. Love, Thomas. I read the letter twice. Then I carried it downstairs and placed it beside our wedding photograph. The trunk remained open. For the first time since Thomas brought it into our house as a young man, there was no lock on it. And there never would be again. It has been several years since the afternoon Anna came to my house, and the old trunk is still here. It no longer sits hidden beneath a wool blanket in the upstairs storage room. I moved it downstairs and placed it beneath the window in the small room where Thomas used to read on Sunday afternoons. The brass lock is still attached, but I threw away the key. Not because I wanted to make certain nobody could open it again, but because there was nothing left to lock. Most of the important papers went to Anna. I kept Thomas's letters, several photographs, and a few harmless pieces of our shared history. The red scarf went home with Anna. She told me she planned to give it to her granddaughter someday, although she wasn't sure how much of the story she would tell. I told her that decision belonged to her now. Anna and I remained in contact. At first, our conversations were mostly about the past. She would remember something Margaret had said, call me, and ask whether Thomas had ever mentioned it. I would find another photograph and mail her a copy. Slowly, however, we stopped talking only about people who were dead. She told me about her children. I told her about mine. We exchanged Christmas cards. She visited again the following summer. Eventually, she stopped being the mysterious little girl from Westfield and simply became Anna. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had opened the trunk when I was young. Would Thomas and I have survived the truth? I believe we would have, but I can't know. Perhaps I would have misunderstood what I found. Perhaps anger would have spoken louder than patience. Perhaps Thomas knew me better than I knew myself. Or perhaps he was simply afraid. That is the uncomfortable thing about the people we love. Sometimes their silence isn't wisdom. Sometimes it is fear. Thomas spent decades believing he was protecting everyone by carrying the truth alone. In some ways he did protect them. In others, his secrecy created wounds that never needed to exist. I spent years wondering whether my husband had another family, whether he had betrayed me, whether the little girl in Westfield was secretly his daughter. None of those things were true. The reality was complicated enough without the stories my imagination created to fill the empty spaces. If Thomas were sitting beside me now, I think I would tell him that. I would tell him he should have trusted me sooner. Then I would probably make him coffee. Because love isn't the absence of disappointment. It isn't discovering that someone was exactly who you imagined them to be. Sometimes love is learning the whole story and realizing that the person you loved was more frightened, flawed, loyal, stubborn, and human than you ever understood. For 50 years, I thought that trunk contained the one secret capable of destroying everything Thomas and I had built. When I finally opened it, I discovered something very different. Our marriage wasn't hidden inside that trunk. Our marriage had happened outside it. It was 46 years of mornings at the kitchen table, children running through hallways, bills we worried about, vacations we couldn't afford but took anyway, arguments over things neither of us remembered a week later, hospital waiting rooms, Christmas mornings, grandchildren, funerals, bad jokes, burned dinners, quiet evenings when neither of us needed to speak. The trunk contained Thomas's past, but I had been his life. It took me 11 years after his death to understand the difference. Sometimes I sit beside that old trunk and run my hand across the scratches surrounding the lock. I remember the young woman who once stood beside it, desperate to know what was inside. I remember the middle-aged woman who became frightened when someone tried to break into our house to reach it. I remember the widow who possessed the key for 11 years but couldn't bring herself to turn it. And I remember the elderly woman who finally did. People sometimes ask whether there are secrets that should remain buried forever. I don't know. Maybe there are. But I know this much. Secret has weight. Someone always carries it. Thomas carried this one for most of his life. Claire carried another version. Margaret carried hers. Robert died trying to protect his. Even Anna carried the empty space created by a truth she didn't know existed. When the trunk finally opened, the past didn't destroy us. It simply stopped asking us to carry it. And perhaps that was what Thomas had been trying to tell me all along when he said I would know when the time was right. Not when everyone was gone. Not when curiosity became unbearable. But when keeping the secret became heavier than letting it go. That old trunk is open now. Sunlight falls across it every afternoon. Sometimes my grandchildren toss blankets on top of it when they visit. Once, my youngest great-grandson climbed inside and pretended it was a pirate ship. I watched him laughing from the doorway and thought about how terrified I once was of that box. Thomas would have laughed too. Maybe that's the final lesson he left me. We spend so much of our lives afraid of what might be hidden inside the people we love that we forget to appreciate what they give us openly every day. I opened Thomas's trunk looking for the secret of his past. What I found instead was a reason to remember our life.